Hey, Dr. James here, and welcome back to another edition of the Dr. James Show. Again, my name is Dr. James Smith Jr., and I am ecstatic, excited, can't wait to get into this interview. And again, you say it every week. You say the same thing, Dr. James, and every week we keep getting better and better and better. Timely discussion, a timely topic. I believe our interview today is one that you're going to watch again and again, and you're going to share it with others. And if you don't, I encourage you to. But before we bring out our guests, our four superstars, let's watch a brief video which sets the tone for our conversation today. Let's take a look.
Fighting to defend and improve the Florida Civil Rights Act, to ensure that all Floridians who experience real discrimination are protected under Florida law. This bill makes a mockery of the Florida Civil Rights Act, turns it completely upside down. It minimizes the seriousness of real complaints of discrimination. Someone who was denied a job promotion, someone who was demoted or fired from their job. Real objective discriminatory action against a person because of their race, color, religion, sex, pregnancy, national origin, age, handicap, or marital status. And sex now has been interpreted by the Florida Commission on Human Relations to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Yes, that's real discrimination. But this bill says employment discrimination, which is a serious act, is now somehow how someone feels about a training. Even trainings that help people understand the pervasiveness of real discrimination. We're now saying somehow feeling discomfort or guilt about a training about discrimination is discrimination. That's twisted. It's wrong, and it's antithetical to what the Florida Civil Rights Act stands for.
What the senator was referring to was the bill HB 7, the woke bill that the Florida governor has signed into effect. In today's show, we're going to talk about that. To do that, we brought some heavy hitters. We have Lenora Billings-Harris, we have Jess Pettitt, we have Dr. Loren Cannon, and we have Major Ben Brooks, who is the founder of Major Ben's Consulting. Lenora Billings-Harris, international author, speaker, Hall of Fame, CSP. Jess Pettitt, wow, with her humor and her brand of diversity, wisdom, knowledge, and implementation is with us. And Dr. Loren Cannon, professor and author. Welcome to the Dr. James Show. My wonderful guests, let's get this party started. What's going on? What's going on? Welcome, welcome, welcome. How is everyone doing today?
Fantastic.
All right, thumbs up on getting this going on. Jess, you're good. Major, you're good. Before we dive in to the video and your reaction to the conversation, why don't you give folks your narrative or your thoughts about what problem do you solve in your role as a professor, as a consultant, as a speaker, as a change agent practitioner, doing the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and transgender rights. What problem do you solve? Start with you, Jess. What problem do you solve?
It's a powerful question. I think probably the main problem that I try to solve is the answer to the question of who are we protecting? And I think the video kind of talked to that as well. Being able to support and protect the most vulnerable people in a way that may not be solution driven. You might not get there, but it's still the right thing to do. It's good enough now.
Love it. I love it. Lenora, how about you? What problem do you solve?
Well, I certainly hope with the leaders that I work with, in particular C-suite, is that I help them solve the problem they see, which is as a leader, how can I intentionally be more inclusive? How can
Mm.
I intentionally understand people who don't look like me, act like me, love like me, etc.? That's what I hope happens, and that's certainly why they reach out to me because they trust that I'll do that.
Both locally and internationally. You do it up, you do it up. Dr. Loren, how about you? What problem do you solve?
Thank you, and I'm so happy to be here. It might be a bit of an overreach to say that myself as a philosopher solves a problem, but what I like to do in terms of the conversations we have in classes with regards to the topic of my book that just came out, is to provide a space for careful thinking about these issues, right? We live in a very politicized environment. There's backlash against, some real important movement in terms of civil rights, for all of us. And I think we need to step back, pay attention to what's happening to our society, and think carefully about the ramifications of what's going on.
I love it. Good job. Thank you. Thank you. Major Ben, how about you, sir?
I like to talk about the empathic nature of how we come together as a group to talk about the blind spots, if you will. When you start talking about bias and things like that, we want to talk about what they are, how they come about, and how it manifests itself in the workplace. And my approach then is say that I want to speak to your head, not to your head, because if I speak to your head, you can rationalize your behavior. But if I speak to your heart, you own that emotion. And the moment we can make that emotional connection with folks up there to understand from an empathic perspective that we're all in this together, and that's the solution for me to bring everybody together.
I love it. I love it. Those of us who do this work, I would say that we all have a story relative to how did we get into this? Either how did we get into it or why are we still doing it? I'm curious, your story, your thoughts. Lenora, how did you get into this line of work?
Ooh, so I'll try to do a Reader's Digest version. um, so when I started my consultancy, I was delivering all different types of training workshops. That training in HR was my background. But by 1994, I was searching for, what should be my lane. And I went to South Africa. I'd been there several times before, but I went there in March of 1994. That was a month before Mandela was elected president. Everyone was very afraid because no African country had ever transitioned to democracy without bloodshed, violence, and death. So there I was in the workshop room with 60 automotive executives, all of them white, all male except for one woman. And to just fast forward, at the end, this woman would never give me direct eye contact, et cetera, et cetera. At the end, though, she waited for everybody to leave. Now, remember, I was searching for what my lane should be and pushing diversity away, by the way. And she came up to me. She was crying profusely. Oprah would call it the ugly cry.
The
Crying,
ugly
the
cry.
ugly cry. And I'm thinking, what did I do? And then I realized it had to be something bigger than that. And what she said to me was this: I'm an Afrikaner. Do you know what that is? And for the viewers that may not know South African history, the Afrikaners were the people in power during apartheid. And she said, when I walked in this morning and I saw you, a Black woman from America, I could not imagine what you could teach me. Now, she's still crying through all of this, but then she said, I realized why, I now realize why I really had to be here. And that was to experience you as 100% human. I have to go home and convince my husband, my sons, and my brothers to lay down their arms because they're preparing to kill every Black person they see. On that 17-hour flight home the next day, I had a lot of time to process. And I realized that it was divine intervention. It's like hit me over the head with a 2x4. I have got to do this work because diversity and inclusion is more than just numbers. It's more than even just the words you use, even though words are powerful. It's about showing up and being authentically who you are and creating a space for others to be authentically who they are. So I had been dabbling in this topic, but then I got really serious about it because I realized the impact.
Love it, love it. Just before you give us your story about how you got into this work, I want to show a little video clip of you in action. Let's take a look.
Any of you remember Ghostbusters? In the original, there is an actress, her name is Annie Potts, and there's a line in the movie where they get their first customer, and she slams down on this buzzer and says, "We got one." This is how most organizations do diversity. They were applauding you, and you walked off stage.
Sorry.
Yeah. Whatever story you wrote about me, being a Texan likely was not part of that story. I'm a complicated person that basically looks like your fun aunt. And now I get to engage with the people coming in from the live stream. Hi, I'm the one that looks like a tropical fish that they may or may not have told you about.
Jess, how did you get into this line of work where you're changing lives and you're making a huge difference?
I similarly had a moment where I was doing a lot of work primarily in the education space from my subordinated or marginalized identities as a queer person. So I was teaching safe zone trainings, mostly to heterosexual people, about how to be less homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, etc. And I realized that in the community that I had formed of my people, I began to notice patterns that were undeniable of racism, classism, sexism within the group of people that I was around because of our marginalization, because we were oppressed. We also had dominant and privileged identities. And I decided from that safe platform, and I'm using air quotes, and I know this language will come up later, but from the quote unquote safe community I created around my marginalized or oppressed identities, I decided to really flip it inside out and do work from our dominant identities. So now as a white person, as an upper class person, as an educated person, I do the work and encourage other people that I do either keynotes or consulting work with to focus on those dominant identities, because all of us have them. And then what we can do from our dominant places is significantly less risky. And the less risk means that it might actually be more successful. So that's how I started doing the work.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Loren and Major Ben, will you weigh in on the video we just saw, the HB7 bill, the Be Awoke bill that's now prevalent? Your knee-jerk reactions, the video and or which you have read or heard about the bill beforehand. Start with Dr. Loren.
I was all ready to have Major Ben go first, but that's good. Well, first, I think what we saw in the video was some authentic passion from the speaker, who's realizing what's happening in Florida, and it kind of goes back to the original question about, any contribution I might have to these kinds of discussions. It's to pay attention and to see what's happening, and the kind of narrative that's being spun, that I would argue is for the benefit of certain politicians to get into power, right? The narratives that first graders are learning critical race theory and something bad is going to happen from that. That's a distortion of the truth. It's a distortion of critical race theory. It's a distortion. It encourages a continued distortion of American history. We also see in Florida the so-called "Don't Say Gay" law. And my work on the politicization of trans identity and trans-directed violence and directed legislation, that's related here, and that has this distorted narrative that little kids are having sex changes, and that we can't trust the teachers in our classroom to make decisions about how to deal with some of these complex issues, which they've been doing for decades. I've been teaching for 30 years. Teachers basically know like where their students are coming from. And I think that the speaker really brings forward the idea of a kind of conflation of maybe a person with a dominant identity, perhaps the person is white or the person is cisgender or heterosexual, that they feel uncomfortable with the recognition of the true history and current status of folks in the United States. They feel uncomfortable with that. And there's a conflation that is being seen as similar to like centuries of oppression, of racism, right? And I think the speaker points that out articulately.
Well, thank you. Major Ben, how did the video land on you, and what's the so what for you? You saw the video, which is talking about essentially watering down the approach a practitioner or an educator or researcher should use when discussing these matters of diversity, equity, inclusion. You saw the video. How did it land on you, and what's the so what for you?
How did it land on me? It struck me very deeply because I saw a person who is very committed and dedicated to a cause. But also I saw an opening for us to look at what's happening behind the scenes. If we didn't hear him, we wouldn't know very much about what's going on. What we saw then with this bill is part of my business when I do this training. I have some foundational principles, and I call it reaction versus response. And what we mean by we react when we don't know what to do. We respond, however, when we have full knowledge. For example, you cannot swim. You sit him by the pool and your 2-year-old child falls into the pool. What are you likely to do? And we say, we'll jump in. What's going to happen? You both are going to drown. But if you understand CPR, first aid, how to swim, no big deal. Every time we react, we get in trouble. Go back in your life, particularly where something that's gone wrong, you will find that more than likely it occurred because we reacted as opposed to responding. As I listened to that guy talking there, and we really don't understand the impact of the reaction. I just happened to had a notion to think about the tsunami. And remember the tsunami back in 2004, when everybody was all upset there. At that tsunami, there were like 230,000 humans lost, but no animals. So what was happening? You see, because the reaction was that something was happening and the humans ran down because they wanted to see what's going on, but they didn't understand the unintended consequences of their action, and we lost a whole lot of people. What we see with this bill, however, is that we have a lot of people reacting, and for the unintended consequences, that the people who are going to be hurt the most are the folks who really don't have the information that they need to operate in this society. Diversity and inclusion is not going away. And the idea here, the more in this misinformation or disinformation, we don't understand the damage that we're doing to folks, because once people find out the truth, they have lost the narrative. And what our responsibility is to make sure that we have the right information that we're going to put forth there so that people will get the right stuff as opposed to the rhetoric that's going on.
Love. Lenora, the bill basically says we don't want people to feel uncomfortable during these training sessions going forward. We don't want them to feel blamed for it. I'm gonna show a clip of you doing what you do, and afterwards, let us know, are you going to be able to still go after diversity, equity, inclusion the same way, or are you going to adjust the way you share and educate? Let's take a look at the video and then let me know if you're going to use that same approach.
Research repeatedly shows that organizations with diverse and inclusive workforce environments outperform their competition in the areas of creativity and innovation, attraction and retention of best talent, and revenue. Inclusion is the challenging part of the equation because of the impact of unconscious or implicit bias. Here are a few actions I invite you to practice with teams and with clients. Ask team members for their ideas before you mention yours. Invite the introverts to share. Be mindful of your unconscious nonverbals, such as eye contact and use of devices when others are talking. Ask for feedback specifically regarding the team process. You can't control the behavior of clients, so here are a few tips to ensure your team members are heard regardless of titles, tenure, age, gender, or ethnicity. Before launching into the focus of the meeting, inform your client of the wealth of talent on your team as you introduce each person. Help the client understand the expertise among all present. If you notice the client is only giving eye contact to you, invite the appropriate team member to answer their questions. Disrupting bias enables diversity of thought, which serves our organizations and our clients.
Differently, if anything, Lenora, that seemed to me as a perfect way to motivate, to educate. You gave tools, a nice, positive, professional approach. What do you have to change?
So, not changing. Well, let me take that back. One of the things I used to always say is I did not believe people would learn when they are feeling threatened. And so my approach to DE&I was not in your face, let me ram this down your throat. I still believe people will learn more if they're, if you draw them in. However, when I reflect back several years ago in what my approach was, the change now is we don't have time to self-pedal everything. Not that I was self-pedaling it before, but I could have been a bit more direct, not to make people feel bad, but to give, to share more facts, to get to the meat of things faster. And someone said this. I saw this a couple of months ago, and I apologize, I can't recall who said this, but what they said was, you're not and if you know bias and how bias works in our brains and that type of thing, they said, you're not responsible for your first thought. Now, that's because we're impacted by all kinds of things that cause us to have our beliefs and biases. You're not responsible for your first thought. You are responsible for your second thought, and you are responsible for your actions. And so that really, without me knowing it, with it phrased that way, it really is the foundation of the work that I do, whether it's a keynote or workshop or consulting, to help people understand, look, you don't need to feel bad because you grew up in an environment where you didn't know much about people different than you didn't know your privileges, that kind of thing. You don't need to feel, that's past. You can't fix that. That's your first thought. But you are responsible for your second thought. And if you truly do want to have that inclusive environment or community where everybody can be respected, that means you got to do some work. All of us have to do some work. It's just as Jess was saying earlier, we all have dominance in some ways, just depending on which group you happen to be looking at the time. And the more we know about that, the more we can be effective in whatever our work is. And I also believe the more we can be willing to provide grace, to provide some forgiveness for folks that just don't know. But we are responsible for our actions. And I believe our actions today in this environment with the bill in Florida, part of our action for all of us that are doing this work is to speak up more often.
Yes.
Instead of, because we know silence is compliance. And the folks that are speaking up the most are the ones who are most extreme.
Good stuff. Jess, I once heard you say, or I read that you said, you're not a thought leader. You teach leaders how to think. Are you going to alter your approach, change your approach? Or are you going to be even more demonstrative or less demonstrative? Will this bill change how you deliver your special brand of magic?
I agree with Lenora. No, This is, I know we're talking specifically about Florida, but this is a very common practice. So there will be dozens of states or local municipalities that have similar kind of politically motivated, to Major Ben's point, bills that are similar to this. And the truth is that I don't believe in mandatory training to begin with, because I don't want anybody in my space that doesn't want to be there. So there's the door, get out. If you'd like to think, come on in. But if you want to go think someplace else, knock yourself out. So even in that sense, I'm in compliance with the bill. When thinking about the funding bills that are getting tacked on to this, ultimately, I would say that I am all about individual freedom and democracy. And what's being eroded is the people's voice to be able to weigh in on these conversations. There's a very big difference between safety and discomfort. And I have absolutely no problem with exactly how I do my work, even in reading the language on the bill. Ultimately, what this will come down to is a subjectivity of enforcement that is deeply rooted in politics. And if you're going to argue individual freedom, then I also have individual freedom to provide a space similar to what Lenora said, for people to be able to think for themselves. That's literally what democracy is based on. And through that approach, I think being thought-provoking actually unravels the lack of enforcement and the lack of rationality behind these kind of nonsensical bills that are really a political move more than a community support move for either side of the argument, and those that don't care about this to begin with. So no, I don't have to change anything.
Dr. Cannon, how does your new book inform how you show up, how you address and discuss the issues that you are tasked with creating a greater level of understanding and appreciation and value?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Oh, and there's my book. Yeah, it is on the politicization of trans identity, particularly through the years 2015 and 2020. And I think what's important, and I'm listening to, my fellow panelists respond, and it's all so thought-provoking, but I think that we can't stop being committed to the truth. And that's kind of what I hear from many of us, is that there's a truth of the matter out there, and we can't back down from that. Right now, so my book, is looking at the incredible amount of legislation that was proposed between 2015, just after the same-sex marriage ruling, up until 2020. Literally hundreds of legislation so that trans and gender nonconforming people can't adopt children, can't express themselves in certain ways, can't receive health care, can't change their names, can't use certain gendered facilities. I mean, it's enormous. Now, what is fascinating about it is a lot of the proposed bills didn't go anywhere. Maybe they weren't passed. Unlike the Florida bill, 1834, the Don't Say Gay bill, a lot of them weren't passed. They weren't signed into law. But you know what? The effects of them is so significant, because what it does is it sets up environment of fear, and it gives a green light to those who wish to demonize, displace, further marginalize individuals with certain identities. And so this is what we see in Florida, whether or not these, the 7 and 1834, whether or not they're repealed, and I hope they are, what you're setting up is that people who were marginalized before are going to be more marginalized on our playgrounds, in our offices, on our street corners. And I think that's why we need to take a close look at this and speak the truth about this. Otherwise, politicians who are wanting to gain votes from this fear mongering are going to control the narrative.
Controlling the narrative. Great segue. Major Ben, say you're in with one of your clients right now, and they just saw that video and they called you. They didn't want to Zoom, they wanted you in person. Major Ben, what do we do? What do we do? Should we go through all of our workshops and materials, the scripts, and take out stuff? How do we tell our consultants? What do we tell our consultants with how to go about it? What are you going to tell that client who is
First of
losing their
all,
mind right now?
first of all, I would say, yeah, I want to do it in person. I want to talk about the realities of where you are. Yeah, see what the educational awareness that we bring is one of the greatest insurance policies that we can have for the organization. Being in person, give me an opportunity to really talk about the truth. We say it's not about blame or guilt. It's about the realities of where we are. We can't talk about diversity and inclusion without making sure that everyone who is at the table has the chance to speak and involve. And what we want to deal with folks in it, it's rather than trying to focus on characteristics, let's focus on what it is that each of these people are going to bring to the table for the organization. We talk about the business case is never going to change. If you don't engage all the talent that you have out there, because of some characteristic that you're trying to peddle for your false narrative, unintended consequences that you are going to lose in the end, because individuals who embrace the talent pool of all those folks who are different out there are going to be those individuals who are going to prosper. And that's what it's really all about. I find that in organizations, someone mentioned the idea of mandatory training. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we do in law enforcement, every year we have to have first aid training, mandatory. Why? Because it's about life decisions, diversity and things like this. We approach this. We shouldn't approach this as something just mandatory. It's an integral part of what we do as our business, because you talk about a mission, vision, and value statement that say one thing, but our behavior says something else. And so the idea then is that when we start doing this awareness education, is that it's like sweeping stairs. It has to start from the top and come down. If you don't have an individual at the top who embrace the kind of stuff that's going to make his organization successful, then it's going to be a program for failure. And the blame then is be put on the consultants who come in. I say, I will not accept that blame. I'm not going to change how I do business, because what I do with my business, I bring the humanity of this thing to the table. And you cannot argue with humanity, because it's not about blame or guilt. It's about you as an individual as opposed to the organization.
This is good. Lenora, I've seen you in action over and over again. You have a way of delivering hard content in a way where people say, can I have some more? Can I have some more? Let's take another look at you in action. Afterwards, I want you to discuss how you built your brand or your approach to how you deliver your diversity tools and wisdom. Let's take a look at you in action again. And how did you cultivate this style?
We could not get through the day if we didn't have bias, because bias is a mental association or a preference. However, we can mitigate some of the negative consequences when our biases are inappropriate or wrong. So the first thing that we can do is to become more self-aware. How I mean that is pay attention to those judgments, those biases that are in our head. Recognize that belonging is so important to us as human beings. When we don't have a sense of belonging, our brain equates it to pain. So imagine in the workplace when people are being excluded unintentionally, they actually are feeling a sense of pain. So think to yourself, how would I feel if someone stole my idea, if someone wasn't listening to me, if someone didn't recognize I was even there? Because that's what, quote unquote, others feel. And then do those things to turn it around.
Painted an amazing picture, and you have an approach, and it's been very successful nationally and internationally. What went into you cultivating your style, your way of delivering your diversity work?
So I think part of it has to do with just my personality, my behavioral style, and also my belief, and all of you on this call know how important Ubuntu is to the foundation of my business. Ubuntu is a Zulu proverb that means I am because we are because I am. And when I learned that proverb, I realized, whew, that is a brilliant way to describe diversity and inclusion, meaning essentially what it boils down to is we are all connected in one way or another. Now, you could take that in a lot of different directions, but if I am doing something in the workplace, whether it's intentional or not, but I'm just going after, the greed or whatever, I'm not only hurting other people, ultimately I'm hurting myself, whether it's how I think about myself or whatever. And so my point is, because I really believe human beings are connected, and I believe, and now research proves it to be so, that belonging is more important than anything else, that we are social beings. Because I believe that, what helped me, and I certainly didn't think of it as, let me build my brand this way. I really was just being who I am, that developed into a brand because I've been doing this so long. But I would constantly ask myself, on this difficult topic or uncomfortable topic for many people, how can I talk about it in a way that helps the people who hear me, see me, or experience me? How can I help them know we're all growing together? Now, one thing I will change, that I caught on the video, which I had done a little while ago, is I said some biases are wrong. I don't believe that. Our bias is, it just is, whatever our bias is. It's what we do with that bias that may be inappropriate. Because remember, we're not responsible for our first thought, which is our bias. We are responsible for our second thought, which is analyzing, does that apply right now with this person? We got to go that step, because that then shifts us from reacting, Major Ben, it shifts us from reacting to responding. If we take that breath and think about it for a moment, now I'm responding based on the here and now with this individual. And the full responding part is the action. So for me, I'm just always looking for, how can I talk about this in a way that people can hear it? I don't believe change happens until people get uncomfortable. Now, that doesn't mean rude and embarrassed or any of that, but change, any kind of change, doesn't happen until we get uncomfortable with the status quo. So how can I get them uncomfortable with the status quo in a way they probably haven't thought about before, uncomfortable enough that they say, okay, I need to do this another way, or I need to think about this, or most important, I need to ask the question. In education, as it's relating to this bill, people go to school supposedly to learn how to think, not necessarily what to think. And if you're going to figure out what you are going to think personally, you need lots of perspectives. So it really concerns me, not only with the politics and the politicians that are doing certain things for their personal gain, but what concerns me is, particularly as a result of the pandemic, but even before then, is people dial into one channel. They get their news from one channel, whether it's on social media or somewhere else, and they never listen to anything else. So they believe it's the truth. When I travel internationally, I'm always fascinated by how international CNN is different than CNN that we see in the States. So we need to be willing to get a little uncomfortable so we can begin to understand different perspectives. And to your point where you started with me, Dr. James, is I had a client say to me once, how have you learned how to feed us castor oil with apparently must have honey in it and we want more? I never thought about it that way, but it's like, if you're taking the dose, that's what I'm happy about.
I love it. The doses. Jess, we're going to do a little bit of throwback right now. We got a little video of you, a throwback of you in action. And it speaks to your style and what you do, but it also speaks to you at one point being burnt out. Let's take a brief look at your TED Talk throwback. Let's take a look.
For some of you, today may be the day that everything changed, right? I mean, we've really had some good information today, but I can actually remember exactly when my work changed. So see, I'm a social justice educator. So for a really long time, I was working around social justice issues from a now mindset. What I mean by that is that everything needed to happen right now. There was a sense of urgency and people didn't get it. I also was generally angry and fairly unsuccessful. So it's interesting, no matter how much your burning issues are really passionate, you really get this sense of urgency, it really doesn't matter because not everybody's on the same boat, right? Like no matter how angry you are, your anger is not a good recruitment tool. Have you noticed that? So I would try and burn brighter and brighter and brighter. Whether I was talking about equity amongst genders or sexism or racism or doing anti-oppression work or transphobia work, I would get more and more enfuegoed, and I'd only really tend to focus on the people who didn't seem to even notice, right? So you're all these people too. We're all fired up about something. Then there's them, right? The deniers. They don't think dinosaurs happened. They think we're in a post-racial society, right? That just because women don't get paid evenly, that doesn't matter. It's because they have babies, right? Like there's all different kinds of stuff out there that they don't necessarily want to talk about the topics I want to talk about. What I found myself doing is that's who I was focusing on, right? If I could make them come to my side, it was a big win. And I was out for the big wins. I would focus on them solely, to the point that I literally got burnt out.
We could watch all of that. That is so good. Jess, you're not burnt anymore. You revive, you're resilient. What now for you? From an approach standpoint, how did you recover? And what do you do now to continue on this journey?
I think that what's really, really important to mention is that was in 2014. So President Obama is president of the United States. And had I stayed burnt and crispy, how would I have possibly survived the last 4 years? Right. And I think that that's a really important thing to name right now as people are dealing with these local or state initiatives or all this blowback and pushback. And I just found out about a Facebook group that believes birds are not real. Like people are very creative. That's not going away. If we can put some of that creative energy to use in a more positive, productive way, those skills will be needed. And I feel like that's the underbelly of how I cured myself of my own burnout, is that instead of trying for now in the hardest cases, I kind of turned myself around and started working with the people who were following. That I started following the people, even though they weren't necessarily noticing me because I wasn't a big enough fish. I cared and I was interested in that work and my opinions mattered. And I believe that role modeling that for other people not only cured them of their burnt outness, but really uncroutoned myself so that I could keep doing this work. The whole concept of good enough now came out of me being burnt to a crisp and yet still feeling called to do this work.
And good enough now is your book, correct?
Yeah, it's my book. And my mantra is do the best you can with what you've got some of the time. I do have to say that doesn't apply to like surgery, but the work that we are doing, if I can do the best I can some of the time with the skills and et cetera resources I already have, then at least I'm doing something. And doing something will keep that momentum moving. And that cures your burnout and keeps you in the game.
Thank you. I anticipate that some folks are going to be considering their trip down Burnout Boulevard because of their self-created stories about what this bill means to them. There is a question in the chat room. Let's take a look. It says, and Dr. Cannon, why don't you give this a try first? It says, do you think bills like the HB7 and Don't Say Gay that are, as Jess stated, political moves are occurring because the next generation of voters are overwhelmingly opposed to such bills that are unlawful, unconstitutional? Do you think these bills are strategic?
That is a great question. Thanks for lobbing that over. I think they are strategic, and the fact that the younger generation is in many ways more inclusive may be adding to the anxiety that some people might feel that society is changing too fast. I mean, there's white folks that are afraid of critical race theory. They don't understand what it is. There are folks that are afraid at the racial reckoning our country is going through after so many of the horrendous events, including George Floyd's murder and others. There are folks who are really anxious when the Supreme Court said that same-sex couples could get married, right? And there's a sense that people feel like the world is changing faster than they can change with it. I mean, not the younger folks, but those who are a little bit older. But I think that fear by itself, kind of, similar to what Lenora was saying, about like maybe that, like, okay, we can be fearful folks and curmudgeon in some ways, but what has happened is that has been weaponized. My book talks about backlash and scapegoating and dog whistling. And backlash, I mean, originally is like a force. Think of industrialization or shooting a gun, that it's not intentional. If the end of a rifle hits me in the shoulder, the rifle's not responsible, right? It's just a mechanical thing. And maybe sometimes the effect of social change is such that we kind of react, but then what happens, it's weaponized by politicians and others. And that's, I think, what has happened. There's people after same-sex that were concerned about the same-sex marriage ruling. And we have politicians with hundreds and thousands of names and emails of people that are afraid. We might as well use those to one's advantage in the next time it comes along in terms of having a new political context. And the fact that the younger folks may be more inclusive, hopefully, I hope that's true, but it just can like lead to stoking the anxiety by those who are nervous about their own worldview.
Good stuff. Time is getting away. Darn. Major Ben, you are a retired major of the Pennsylvania Police Patrol.
State Police, excuse me.
Yeah. State Police Patrol. You are author. You've been a speaker for a number of years. You're a consultant. You are unconscious bias expert. Number one, what keeps you going? And number two, were you ever burnt out? Did you ever want to stop doing this work?
well, let me do it.
Ever exhausted or so overwhelmed where you just wanted to say, time out, I'm out?
Let me take the last one first. No, I am not burned out. Why do I do this work? I do this work because it's so vitally necessary. Coming in right now, I'm doing a lot of work with the law enforcement, and right now, all 600 judges of the minor judiciary of Pennsylvania are going through my course right now on leadership of blind spots of bias. You know, that's very, very, very important. The idea here for me, I grew up in a segregated society in North Carolina as a kid. I come here and I'm involved with the state police. Throughout the years, I was involved with one of the biggest lawsuits on discrimination in the history of the state police. I testified extensively, paid dearly for it. You know, I spent 4 years in a court battle before it was finally adjudicated, you know, that I was exonerated, you know, and then we were moved from there. When Governor Casey came into office and I came into Harrisburg and I took over the affirmative action contract compliance, and in that capacity developed the program Diversity and Inclusion. And I was part of an interagency task force dealing with diversity and inclusion in relation to hate crimes with law enforcement and corrections throughout Pennsylvania. So that got me going, you know. So I retired in 1992 and I kept doing this because someone has to be the voice of reason. You know, when I'm talking to folks out there, I know that folks are upset about a lot of stuff, but I want to know your story. because your story is based on the biases that you have developed over the years, and your story guides the decisions that you're going to make. Now, I am not trying to change your mind. I only want you to change your story. And you can only change your story with new information or a necessity. And that to me is at the heart of what we talk about, because I deal with, because what law enforcement and judges, these are some of the toughest people that you can deal with, but I'm finding that I'm being effective because they're saying to me like, wow, you're making a lot of sense. And this is what because I try to humanize them as much as possible to, again, get away the blame and guilt, and we can have the conversation, because once I understand your story, you understand my story, then we have a conversation. Otherwise, we are yelling back and forth, and yelling never solves a problem.
Woo. Lenora, with all the books you've written and the talks you've given, what are you going to say to that potential mentee who comes to you and says, Lenora, I'm not as polished as you are. I'm not as seasoned as you are. I mean, you've forgotten things I haven't thought of. And this thing has me nervous as a practitioner. It has me nervous as the diversity, equity, and inclusion director or VP of an organization. What's in your books or what's in your experience? What advice would you give me right now? Because I'm not embracing uncertainty relative to where we're going next in this diversity journey.
So when I started this work, you couldn't get a degree in it. You couldn't get a certification in it. It was a topic, and it was only diversity way back then, not all the other things we've added to it. And so I had to educate myself, to read lots of books and that type of thing, and listen to people, watch other people doing the work in order to find my own voice. And so what I say to people who reach out to me, whether they're in corporate and now maybe they just accepted the position as head of diversity, and they did it because they're passionate about diversity, but it's not their background, or when I'm talking to speakers and trainers or educators that want to do this work, the same is still true. Even though now you can study it, you can take courses, you can get certifications, you still have to do your work. You have to be committed to be hungry for learning, and then condense all of that into a way you can deliver it. So even though all of us do similar work, we don't do it the same way. We do it based on our story, based on our experience. And what I find is the most challenging is people will say, yes, so I want to do this work. And so how do I get to where you are? Well, took 30 something years. So, but time by itself is not enough, because you could just keep repeating the same year, right? So just be willing to constantly learn. I mean, I sometimes I think of something that I said a month ago, or even when I corrected myself from the earlier video, something I said a month ago, or certainly 2 years ago, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've learned so much more since then. I really need to twist it and say it this way. So I'm constantly looking for ways to do this work more effectively to impact long-term sustainable change.
Yeah. And Lenora, and this is for everyone, in doing this work, it requires a certain level of confidence and courage. Dr. Cannon, where do you pull, or where does your confidence and courage to do this work, where does it derive from?
What a question that is. I think as a philosopher, there's something very comforting in thinking deeply and carefully about topics. And so that in a sense, I feel supported by that. And then as a teacher, I talk to my students, and I talk to my students about some of the most important questions of our age. And I'm so impressed with them, with their curiosity and their commitment to racial and social justice, and having a society that many of us, never thought would, come to pass. And so I think it's those two things. I mean, the kind of quiet and aloneness with ideas, and then to interact with my students. I find so encouraging and helpful.
So good, so good. This flight, this trip, this hour has flown by, but it's time for the closer. As speakers, as educators, you want to finish bang with this. You want to finish with a bang. You want to finish strong. What we're going to do is get each of you to give us a 30-minute, the mic ready, a 30-second, not 30-minute, 30-second, one final keynote where the focus is going to be on you. If you want to get a close-up, you can move in, but one final keynote where you share in 30 seconds your encouragement, your words of support for people who are doing this work. What do you want them to do differently? How do you want them to feel? What approaches? You're the coach right now. 30 seconds, weigh in and give them some encouragement, some thoughts going forward, because they have to do the work. They have to do the work. I'm going to start out with you, Major Ben. 30 seconds, your keynote, your encouragement, your inspiration, you're on.
I tell folks this, we talk a lot about empathy, and I always end with them saying to each of them, it's like the grain of sand in the oyster. You have to walk a mile in my shoes to understand what corns and bunions feel like.
Ouch, ouch, ouch. I'm having a visual. I'm having a visual. Mic drop, mic drop. How about Jess, JP, your words of wisdom?
Sure. I would say to any speaker, consultant, audience member, regardless what your job is, remember you go to a grocery store. And as someone sharing the planet for as long as we get to share the planet, there is value in curiosity, generosity, authenticity, and vulnerability that you can provide to a stranger without ever even engaging in them. And the work that we are doing when we know who we're engaging to, the work that we're doing when we know what we're up against and we're getting some pushback, those are all knowns. And if you can practice in your own world without the knowns, curiosity, generosity, vulnerability, and authenticity, you will be doing this work regardless of the pushback. Keep doing the work.
I love it. Keep doing the work. Would that tie into your radical amazement?
100%. Absolutely. You get compassionate exhaustion or radical amazement.
And no more us versus them. I love it. I've done my research. I love it. Lenora Billings-Harris, our Hall of Famer. Talk to us. Words of wisdom for the folks who are tuning in.
People fear that which they do not understand. So become curious instead of critical.
I love it. I love it. What you created for me just now when you said curious, I heard curious, but I also heard courageous at the same time. Good stuff. Good stuff. Dr. Cannon, bring us home. Words of wisdom, thoughts.
Well, I'm going to continue to focus on words that begin with C in terms of curiosity and courage. And I like to emphasize for folks, whether by themselves in a quiet moment or with others, to have the courage to investigate beliefs. Have the courage to investigate why you believe something, particularly if that belief is particularly tied to one's dominant identity. Why do you believe that's true? And ask yourself why 2 more times. Why do you believe that's true? And then you answer it. Why is that relevant to the question? Why do you believe that's true? Ask yourself why 3 times. And then we start really investigating our beliefs, and hopefully with that start doing some work with ourselves that will allow a greater belongingness for all of us.
Drop, 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 drop before it drops. Well, Jess, Lenore, Dr. Cannon, Major Ben, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your views. I mean, we could have done 4 shows, an hour with each one of you. So thank you for working together flawlessly as a team. You provided your opinion, you gave us tools, you gave us approaches. Thank you very much. And for those of you who joined us, I keep telling you, tune in. Informational, transformational, wisdom, tips, tools. We did it again. Now you know I get so happy and pumped before we get started, because I know what you're going to give, what you're going to receive. We'll see you next time. Bring some friends, bring people in your organization, bring your leaders to tune in. And as I always say, you've just been Gym-Pacted. See you later.